Five Nights at Freddy's 2. It's something that I've talked about quite a bit on this channel to the point that it's almost second nature. I've made a full series of guides on this game, played a ton on live streams, and spent many hours poring over the game and looking for the perfect strategy to finally solve it. But one thing that I've never done is actually take a step back and analyze exactly how the game works. I don't mean gameplay-wise, we've already dissected that quite a bit. I mean finding out what makes it work as a game. How it creates a unique fear in players, brutally punishes mistakes, and of course balances extreme game knowledge with overpowering RNG. And perhaps most importantly, how a particular fan game ran with the same formula and did it even better. When you think of FNaF 2 remakes, you might think of TRTF2 Winter Wonderland, or maybe another FNaF fan game open source, or if you're very unfortunate, whatever the hell this is supposed to be. All of these fan games are great remakes, with the exception of that last one, but we're going to be saving them for another day and tackle a fan game that no one would ever consider a FNaF 2 remake. Five Nights at Chuck E Cheese Rebooted. If you don't see the similarities between these two, I can't say I blame you. At first glance, many would consider this to be a pretty unique fan game that's more similar to FNaF 1 than anything else. You watch things slowly move closer to your office through the cameras, light up the hallway next to you, then shut a big heavy metal door if someone's there. As the game progresses, it starts to introduce more unique mechanics and really step into its own style, but by the time you reach the custom night, you'll probably pick up on the fact that this game has been going through a slow transformation of sorts. It starts out as a FNaF 1 parallel, quickly becomes its own unique adventure, and in the end ascends into a full-fledged FNaF 2 parallel with a very familiar formula. Now, calling this a FNaF 2 remake is a big stretch and definitely not true, but there are many strong similarities, and the game's max mode, True Nightmare, will eventually give deja vu to anyone who's spent a good amount of time on 1020. To understand the parallels between these two seemingly unconnected games, we'll first have to do a deep dive into each one individually before bringing them together, so let's get started. Real quick though, I wanted to give a quick shout out to my friends Fantasy Jared and Bonnie360. Like the last analysis video, they both helped a lot in the making of this one. Jared edited the script and Bon made the amazing thumbnail. They both have channels and are very talented FNaF players, so you should definitely go support them. Links are in the description and cards. Let's talk about FNaF 2. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear its name? As in, your immediate reaction when you think about it. Depending on who you are, your first thought may be either the best FNaF game or overrated garbage. Honestly, I can't really blame you for either answer. FNaF 2 is one of the more controversial games in the series, and while it's almost universally well-liked, there's a bit of a split in the fandom between people who consider it the peak of FNaF and people who think it's a decent game, but significantly overrated compared to other entries in the series. Personally, I actually quite like FNaF 2, but I tend to lean more toward the latter option. It's a great game, but there's a few other entries that are definitely better in my opinion. However, if you're of a more neutral stance, your first thought was probably some form of chaos or maybe even RNG, and those are good answers. This is kinda what FNaF 2 built a reputation on. It's a very fast-paced game that punishes mistakes and hesitation brutally on later nights. With 11 hostile animatronics constantly shuffling around the place, you have to be on top of everything, and a single minor slip-up can spell the end of a run. Sometimes it's an instant death at the hands of Foxy if you weren't able to flash him enough, or perhaps you just barely missed a mass timing and a withered animatronic will kill you in mere seconds. Other times, it just puts you on a slippery slope that you can't recover from, where you can stay alive for minutes at a time in some cases, but will eventually be overwhelmed by threats and succumb to the puppet even if you don't make another major mistake. This is best shown in 1020 mode, regarded by many as quite possibly the most unforgiving challenge in the entire series. While 1020's reputation largely amounts to the mode's extreme difficulty, there's another component involved: RNG. In gaming terms, this essentially means luck, and it is very prevalent throughout the FNaF series. FNaF 2 in particular is one of the most unpredictable games in the series, as the game is capable of giving completely unwinnable situations to the player even on night 6. If you watched my video on the animator's hell, you'll probably recall that I concluded that RNG, while healthy for a horror game, becomes extremely toxic in large doses and can corrupt an otherwise good game. Is this the case for FNaF 2? Yeah, probably. RNG is, without a doubt, FNaF 2's biggest flaw, and it's something that FNaF pros, including many of my friends and I, have been very invested in trying to solve for over a year now. We've made a lot of good progress, we've made a lot of improvements to make FNaF 2 significantly less luck-based, but we still don't have a fully consistent strategy and probably never will. But hey, that's a story for another day and not the main focus of today's video. The point is that FNaF 2 is, and always will be, heavily based on RNG. There's countless examples of this, but two of the most ridiculous scenarios that I can think of have to deal with Toy Bonnie and Foxy. Toy Bonnie can theoretically camp in the vent for the entire night, and Foxy is so aggressive that his AI has a small chance to overclock. As a result, this game, especially 1020 mode, can be obnoxiously frustrating to play at times. It's a poorly balanced mess, and yet almost everyone seems to love it not despite that, but precisely because of it. I'm not even just talking about casual or intermediate players either. A number of pros have gone on 1020 marathons and obtained a high number of wins, usually because they're testing new strategies, but some of them also just really like the flow of the mode. It's easy to understand why. This is a mode that requires perfect precision, an incredibly broad amount of game knowledge, and a bit of luck to beat somewhat consistently. I went on a binge myself a while back and got my total win count to 31 wins before I took a break, and I can confirm that there's something inherently addictive about a perfect 1020 run that just feels very smooth to execute. Overall, a lot of high-level players have a sort of love-hate relationship with this mode. It's poisoned by RNG, but flows strangely well, and that leads to a very weird experience to say the least. Anyway, this should give you a pretty good idea of why FNaF 2 is a controversial game. From a perspective of game design, it has too many flaws to be considered a great entry in the series, but something about it just works. In its own twisted, unique way, it keeps players coming back for the rush of executing a night perfectly. Speaking of unique approaches, the scare factor here is also unlike any other FNaF game, choosing to focus on scaring the player by overwhelming them and waiting for them to drown in sheer panic, rather than relying on any conventional means of horror. Don't get me wrong, the jump scares are very solid, and the atmosphere, sound design, and animatronics are all freaky enough, but the real horror in FNaF 2 comes from panic more than anything else. You could argue that UCN later repeats this strategy, but it doesn't do it nearly as effectively, being more focused on an outrageous level of challenge than anything else. At its core, FNaF 2 sets new players up to fail from the very beginning, but not in a super underhanded way like many fan games. It applies a ton of pressure from every angle early on and waits for newcomers to falter, then punishes mistakes very harshly. Once the player grows skilled enough for 1020 mode, it takes this formula to a logical extreme and starts playing dirty. The smallest mistake will spell almost certain death, as the game frequently forces extremely volatile situations upon the player if luck isn't in their favor. It starts off very well and provides a type of horror unique to this specific game in the series, but eventually spirals into a whirlwind of confusion and taints an otherwise amazing game with overwhelming amounts of RNG. While it still works in its own way, as I mentioned earlier, when it really comes down to it, this game is deeply flawed. Some people take the RNG in stride and roll with it, but many others see it as damaging to the experience, and they have a very fair point there. Next, let's look at the fangame Five Nights at Chuck E Cheese Rebooted, which I'll be referring to as CECR from now on. CECR started from humble beginnings, first appearing as a relatively niche fangame in 2015 with one major problem. It was really bad. Well, that may be overly harsh. I've never played the original version myself, and therefore can't accurately judge it, but I've seen some footage and can understand why the developer wanted to leave this game abandoned for a long time. That is, until 2021, when the game received a full reboot courtesy of Radiance, the same team behind the Treasure Island remaster. Obviously, it was a lot better than the original. Since then, CECR has remained a well-respected, if slightly underrated, fangame among the community. While CECR does eventually become a strong parallel to FNaF 2 in many ways, it takes its time getting there. It starts out similar to FNaF 1 at the beginning, then forms its own identity throughout the rest of the main game as unique mechanics are introduced, such as the stage call and portraits. Even the mechanics that seem to be carried over from FNaF 1 have significant changes, with the only door actually being a gate that takes several seconds to close and must be held shut manually. While CECR does eventually become a strong parallel to FNaF 2 in many ways, it takes its time getting there. It starts out similar to FNaF 1 at the beginning, then forms its own identity throughout the rest of the main game as unique mechanics are introduced, such as the stage call and portraits. The main parallel to FNaF 2 here is both a striking similarity and a big difference. As you may only realize later, CECR chooses overwhelming panic as its main weapon to strike fear into the hearts of players, just like FNaF 2. On the later nights, you'll need to keep a clear head and move fast to stay alive. Between stalling costume, catching Munch, locking Chuck E out of the office, and using the stage call to deter the others, you'll have quite a bit to juggle by nights 4 and 5. And as Postura once said about FNaF 2, every second you spend doing something is a second taken away from doing something else, and that is far more pronounced here. An extra second spent with costume can make all the difference, and this will eventually start to show on True Nightmare. These circumstances create an ever-present sense of anxiety as you begin to not only question every single move you make, but also question every move that you don't make. This can very easily cause panic to slowly set in, as while you're trying to decide if you're making the right call, you may freeze up and not be able to make decisions nearly as quickly. This is known by many as paralysis by analysis, and I'd argue that it's a main overarching theme in CECR. This is part of what makes True Nightmare one of the most challenging max modes ever, even long after it stops being scary. When every second counts toward dictating the final outcome of the run, you start to get very paranoid about how you're spending each one of those seconds. The difference between how FNaF 2 and CECR use panic against a player is night and day. FNaF 2 rushes you with overwhelming threats from all angles as quickly as possible. Night 1 starts out reasonably calm, then Night 2 adds a few more animatronics, and by Night 3 you have the entire gang coming after you. It's very obvious that the plan is to throw you off, and that is the main theme of the game from the start. Everyone remembers FNaF 2 for the chaos, but no one remembers CECR for it unless they're a hardened True Nightmare veteran. This isn't because CECR is any less overwhelming or chaotic than FNaF 2, because believe me, it's not. It's simply because CECR takes its sweet time in building up the true obstacle of the game, which is panic. It uses more standard FNaF horror throughout, arguably better than FNaF 2 does. It has better models, better atmosphere, better sound design, and a pretty creepy game over screen to boot. It only adds one animatronic per night on average, slowly adding more and more responsibilities until you eventually realize just how thin you're stretched. Then you finish Nightmare mode, and it adds a 7th animatronic. And after the next challenge, it adds an 8th, and a 9th, and a 10th. Now suddenly you have 10 animatronics to deal with, and you've barely practiced with half of them. And after a few attempts of True Nightmare, you really know what you're in for, and it's absolutely not any easier than FNaF 2's 1020. The key difference is that FNaF 2 surprises and overwhelms you with something that comes out of nowhere, while CECR surprises and overwhelms you with something that's been right in front of you all along. Now I'm sure that you all have your preferred gameplay styles and probably like one of these games better than the other, but I believe that CECR comes out with an edge here, and I'll explain why. It's time to compare the two games head to head and see how their preferred styles affect their max modes. Before we look at the differences between Golden Freddy mode and True Nightmare, we first have to see what makes them similar. Both modes feature 10 animatronics at 20 AI attacking the player from all angles. Because of this shared setup, both modes have a very similar flow where the focus is on waiting out attack timers as long as possible and juggling threats successfully. In both games, you have 3 main tools to defend yourself with. In FNaF 2, these are the Freddy Mask, Flashlight, and Music Box. In CECR, they're the Gate, Stage Call, and Monitor. There are also other minor tools used in between, but these are the big 3. As Posture points out in his FNaF 2 analysis, none of these tools can be used at the same time, so every second spent on one allows animatronics halted by the other two to progress. The same is true for CECR, and this comes into full effect in both 1020 and True Nightmare. However, CECR uses this even more effectively. In 1020, you have a set pattern that you repeat all throughout the night. You have to make occasional deviations, of course, but only really when Toy Bonnie shows up. Otherwise, the strategy is cut and dry at all times. Wind music box for a few seconds, put on Freddy mask, take off Freddy mask a few seconds later, flash Foxy, repeat. A lot of the fun comes from testing new strategies and making tiny optimizations to go as fast as possible, but it can be quite repetitive. True Nightmare is much less repetitive and much more nerve-wracking, as you'll have to make decisions on the fly as threats come at you in real time. Munch could decide to leave his position anytime he feels like it, and he doesn't always give an audio cue, so you'll have to keep an eye on his portrait constantly and react quickly if he leaves. Likewise, Chuck E could appear behind you at pretty much any time, possibly even at the same time that Munch leaves. In this case, you have to decide who to deal with first. This is called prioritization, and it's the main skill needed to beat True Nightmare. Prioritization is required even when only one threat is attacking, as you'll want to wait out timers as long as possible. Costume becomes more stalled out every single frame that you spend watching him, and even 10 frames, or 1/6 of a second, can make or break a True Nightmare run. Playing safe in True Nightmare will always end in death, as you need to be both incredibly precise and very aware of these timers to make every second count. Speaking of repetition, I mentioned earlier that CECR adds 4 new characters on the custom night. This helps keep True Nightmare fresh, as it feels like an entirely different experience when compared to the main game. Meanwhile, 1020 is just all the threats you've seen before, but way faster. Technically, Golden Freddy is added on night 6, but he's by far the easiest animatronic to deal with, so he doesn't really add anything. True Nightmare also has a strong emphasis on patterns. Not a constant gameplay loop like FNaF 2, but rather combinations of characters that tend to attack around the same time. This night isn't fully scripted, but it's still pretty consistent, a bit like Animator's Hell, for example. Learning these patterns and preparing for them is a key part of True Nightmare and helps keep it engaging all the way through. In 1020, you're basically repeating the same loop over and over and praying that you don't get destroyed by bad RNG for 7 minutes straight. Meanwhile, in True Nightmare, you're making calculated decisions and tracking who's likely to appear next, which determines your next action. It's really more similar to 5020 than anything else in that regard, as each hour feels like a different segment instead of just 1/6 of the night. But now, for the biggest question of all. Does True Nightmare manage to avoid FNaF 2's biggest flaw of overwhelming RNG? No. No, it doesn't. You're still pretty likely to get forced into unwinnable situations and die with no real way to prevent it. But honestly, it's not quite as frustrating. The more you attempt True Nightmare, the more you feel like you deeply understand the game. The more you attempt 1020, the more you feel like chucking your PC out of an 8-story window. Even after several hours, there's still a lot in True Nightmare that you can do better, more knowledge to pick up, and more optimizations to make. Despite its heavy emphasis on RNG, it can actually be pretty fun to learn, and that is how you fix FNaF 2 without getting rid of what makes it unique, the frustrating chaos. Overall, CECR is, in my eyes at least, a better FNaF 2 in almost every way. It follows the same formula of relying on panic to intimidate the player, only allowing them to use one method of defense at a time, and punishing inevitable mistakes very harshly. Unfortunately, it also inherits some of FNaF 2's flaws, mainly too much RNG. Regardless, it makes the very best of a bad situation and has even better typical FNaF horror during the build up to the max mode. It's a pretty creepy game with much more comfortable pacing than FNaF 2, and it later becomes a monumental challenge. It's an all-around solid FNaF fan game with a max mode very similar to 1020 that is both harder and more bearable. For anyone who likes the style of the original FNaF trilogy, I'd highly recommend giving this one a playthrough. It's available for free, and the link to the GameJolt page can be found in both the description and cards. These games and their similarities have been really interesting to analyze, so let me know your own thoughts in the comments, in the Discord server, or over on Twitter. With that being said, thank you guys for watching this analysis. I hope you found this as thought-provoking as I did, and I will see you in the next one.